Hello, distinguished guests and friends. Welcome to UCLA Terasaki Center's annual Global Japan Forum. My name is Hitoshi Abe, Director of Terasaki Center, UCLA. This forum brings together renowned experts in various fields to analyze and discuss key issues facing Japan today in the global context. It aims to create an interdisciplinary and transnational platform in which to engage Japan from new and innovative perspective and to connect the world of academic scholarship to broader community. In conjunction with the Japan House exhibition Designing with Disaster, Stories from Seven Cities, planned by ArcDR 3, this year's forum invites renowned architects, academics, and environmental researchers from both Los Angeles and abroad to discuss the lessons learned from past environmental disasters and how to create disaster-resilient environment to safeguard our future. Next, please. As you can see in the schedule here, the forum consists with two sessions, disasters around the world and designing the future. By exploring these topics in open and dynamic series of dialogue, we hope to share the forward-thinking approach to disaster risk reduction and resilience and highlight the work that is currently being done to ensure the safe future for us all. So now, actually, I'd like to invite two dignitaries to their speech to kick off this event. First person is Consul General of Japan to Los Angeles, Kenko Sone. So please welcome Consul General Sone to the podium with a round of applause.
Good afternoon, event organizers, panelists, and distinguished guests. My name is Kenko Sone. I'm Consul General of Japan in Los Angeles. And it is my great pleasure to join you for the Global Japan Forum 2023, Designing with Disaster. I would like to especially welcome those who travel to Los Angeles all the way from Japan, Chile, Australia, Hong Kong, Seattle, New York. I hope I don't miss any other places, but those locations from other locations for the important and truly international forum. We hold this symposium in conjunction with the Japan House Los Angeles exhibit Designing with Disaster, Stories from Seven Regenerative Cities. So if you have not yet visited the exhibit, or even if you already visited, please do visit the exhibit as many times as possible. It will be on the second floor of this building. And this coming March, it will have been 12 years since the 2011 Great East Japan earthquake and tsunami. And also this year, 2023, I just learned, I just realized that it is also the 100 years since Kanto Great Earthquake, which was occurred in September 1st, 1923. By the way, this is also another 100 years anniversary of the Disney. It's funny. It's very. I was really, in a sense, surprised that at the time of the Great Kanto earthquake, Disney already started. But back to the Great East Japan earthquake. There are two lessons from that disaster. The first, we cannot really prevent disasters, but we can reduce the risk of disaster or reduce disaster losses of lives and assets. And second, we should not just rebuild the same as before, but we should build back better. And these are the key message to come out of the third UN World Conference Disaster Risk Reduction held in Sendai, Japan in March 2015. So I think the Build Back Better has been used in the various occasions, but I think this Sendai framework was the original, the owner of this phrase of the Build Back Better. And based on this background, people are committed to rebuilding efforts to the region affected by the 2011 earthquake and tsunami. Such efforts has provided many opportunities to think about ways to design resilient architecture, and that is universal. For instance, here in Southern California, Southern California is susceptible to earthquake and wildfires, as well as somehow we are recently experiencing heavy rainfalls causing the floods and mudslides. So the designing with disaster is a very relevant concept in this region as well. So it's very much encouraging to see international experts, such as architects, academics, and environmental researchers actively engaged in discussions about applying lessons learned from past disasters. The ARC-DR3 initiative, Architecture, Urban Design for Disaster Risk Reduction and Resilience, brings together UCLA and Tohoku University in collaboration with the 11 Pacific Rim universities. This initiative is a noteworthy example of collaborative international efforts to address disaster resilience and planning of the broader societal scale. So my hope is that Japan, through its technologies and design innovations, can lead the global discussions. Events such as the Global Japan Forum offer a platform to engage in further dialogues for international awareness about our environment and how design and innovation can contribute to making our society more resilient and sustainable. So last but not the least, I would like to thank UCLA Terasaki Center for Japanese Studies and the Japan House Los Angeles for hosting this today's forum. And I'm very much looking forward to insight offered by all of the speakers today. Thank you very much.
Japan House Los Angeles has been one of the great collaborators for Terasaki Center. And they are the co-host of this event, and of course the host of the exhibition Designing with Disaster, actually happening in the gallery downstairs. So please check it out after this talk. It might be really different before you see this talk. So now I'd like to introduce Yuko Kaifu, President of Japan House Los Angeles. Please welcome her to the podium with a round of applause.
Thank you, Hitoshi. I'd like you to give a big round of applause to Hitoshi Abe, UCLA professor, without whom none of this would have happened. So thank you, Hitoshi. Good afternoon, everyone. I wish to thank you so much for joining us in this significant forum co-presented by UCLA Terasaki Center of Japanese Studies and Japan House at Los Angeles. We're very honored to co-host this. I'm not going to repeat too much of what the Consul General has already said, but yes, we have just opened to the public this new exhibition, Designing with a Disaster, yesterday, and we already have quite a few visitors who are watching and studying the exhibition with great attention. Some of them were taking notes and things, and it's we feel it very enlightening to see those people. The work has been in progress since 4 years ago or so when Hitoshi came to us and started to discuss about doing this exhibition. Because I thought that it could be quite difficult and complex to understand for general public to understand, but it's not, because the core message is that we cannot conquer nature. We cannot overcome natural forces. We have to learn how to live with the nature, in the nature. And that's what it is all about. And you can see that the title of the exhibition, Designing with Disaster, and something that I discussed with my team at the beginning. Why is it that it's designing with disaster, not designing for disaster or designing against disaster? It really is designing with disaster because we cannot prevent disaster from happening. We have to keep ourselves resilient, flexible, and adaptable to make sure that the disaster, that the impact of the disaster will be reduced and kept minimum. So that's the spirit of it. And this symposium forum would help us facilitate understanding the depth of this exhibition. So some people ask me, why is it not taking place on campus of UCLA? And it makes sense. It would make sense to have it at university. But by doing this here, of course, we know that there are quite a few scholars and academians and professionals, but also some of you must be someone like me who is a layman, but then have deep understanding or deep appreciation or deep interest in learning more about what the future holds for us, how we can do to improve our quality of life vis-a-vis the nature or as part of nature. So thank you. And as two of the gentlemen said, our exhibition is open and it's open till 8 p.m. today. So please make sure to revisit. Thank you and please enjoy.
Thank you, President Kaifu. I kind of realized that you can explain about the Actual 3 and also exhibition much better than I can do now after spending so much time, but thank you very much for your great support. Well, now, without further ado, we should start. So the first session, Disasters Around the World, features 3 experts in disaster research and will center on the discussions about the various disasters affected Japan, US, and South America, and explore the ways we have adapted to disaster risk and responded to disaster situations. So first of all, actually, please welcome Professor Mohamed Sharif and Professor William Marotti, the moderators of the first session, to the podium with a round of applause.
Thank you, Hitoshi. So I think what we're going to do is we're going to introduce all 3 of our panelists up front and invite them to the podium, and then Professor Imamura is going to begin his presentation. So it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Imamura. Professor Imamura is Professor of Tsunami Engineering and Director of the International Research Institute of Disaster Science at Tohoku University. And there's some more details of his work up here, but he is an international expert on tsunami modeling for warning, mitigation planning, and education with extensive experience in both Japan and around the world. He's led several field surveys surveying damage from earthquakes and tsunami following the 1992 Nicaraguan and later Indonesian tsunami events, and was an early advocate for international awareness of tsunami dangers, an initiative finally realized in the UN's proclaiming November 5th as World Tsunami Awareness Day in 2015. He was advocating it in, I think, the 2000s. He was also the 2020 recipient of the Hamaguchi Award for his work building coastal disaster resilience. And please come to the stage, Professor Imamura, and please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you, Bill. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce the other 2 speakers this afternoon. I'll start with Professor Renato Delancon from the Pontifical Catholic University of Chile, a gentleman with whom I have had a very long Zoom relationship. Great to see you. As your bio reads, you are a professor in Santiago in Chile. You are, were educated both in Chile and at Cornell in Ithaca. You're a Fulbright scholar. You have a German footprint as well at the TU Berlin. At the university in Chile, you teach design studios, building technology, and you're engaged in research, obviously, on multi-hazards, a topic that you'll be speaking to today, and you also serve as the academic deputy director. How you found the time to be here, I have no idea. You've also been a guest faculty in Milan at the Polytechnic and again at the TU in Berlin. Your scholarly work includes environmental design and performance of buildings, and you've published a number of books and essays on these topics, and an extremely relevant publication that attests to your research in disaster management and heritage recovery is Reclaiming Heritage, and you're also engaged in research on circular economies in architecture. So thanks for being here, and I'd like to welcome you to the stage. And last for this session, it's an honor to introduce Dr. Jack Cohen, who's a retired U.S. Forest Service researcher, among many things. Dr. Cohen is a fire scientist with expertise in determining how structures ignite during extreme wildfires. You've been involved in wildland fire research since the early 1970s, and you've served at the U.S. Forest Service Fire Labs in Missoula, Montana, and you've served as a research researcher and a research physical scientist at the Fire Sciences Laboratory there. You've also spent time in Macon, Georgia, and Riverside, California, close to here, where at the Riverside Forest Fire Lab, you researched live fuel fire behavior in the California shrublands or the chaparrals. Jack, you have also previously served operationally as a prescribed fire ignition supervisor and fire behavior analyst, things that I think that we secretly all want to do. And for almost 2 decades, you've focused your research on how wildland urban fire disasters occur and how homes ignite. You've been a principal scientist in things like international crown fire modeling experiments in the Northwest Territories, and you currently focus your research on the fire dynamics related to live shrub and tree canopy fire behavior. Welcome.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. This is Imamura, director of the EDDES at Tohoku University. It was started just after the Tohoku earthquake tsunami in 2012, 1 year after. So it is a great pleasure and honor, and also excited for me to present some story and current situation now in Japan. So before starting my talk by using this slide, remind you that we are living in the ring of fires, many earthquakes, tsunami, volcanoes, so on. So as I mentioned in the beginning this session, we cannot control the disasters, such a variety, but the idea of the Build Back Better, it was adopted in the 2015 Sendai, could including the risk management, could reduce the damages. And then we can live together with harmony. So as you know, Japan had many experiences caused by the natural disasters. So we have some kind of countermeasures. We can divide into the 2 types of the countermeasures. One is the structured. Yes, we have a seawall and breakwater and dike, and also controlling the forest by utilizing some natural function, and especially started in the 1930s, not so old, after the Sanriku earthquake tsunami, and also 1960 by the Chile tsunami, 1960. So, and we have the non-structural measures. It now become more important. Tsunami warning and evacuation drill, or some planning and education and awareness. So when we visit some area in Japan, you can realize many stone memorial, telling us what happened and what do for the next disaster prevention. So this is some activities and countermeasures before the 2011. So by collaboration with historians, they suggest us some history of the earthquake tsunami by using the historical document, telling us a kind of the repeatedness or cycle of the earthquake tsunami like this. So this is the Sendai and the Tohoku offshore the Pacific Ocean. So you can see the occurrence series of the earthquake tsunami in the north green area. This has occurred 5 times for 400 years. So roughly we can estimate that every 80 years we have the earthquake accompanied by the tsunami, magnitude maybe 8. So next one, only 2 times for 400 years. So low frequency, but larger earthquake and tsunami. So we have some record, and this is very important for risk assessment. But in the time of the 2011, to cover the whole area and extend to the Fukushima, where nuclear plant is located. So we cannot estimate so large earthquake at that time. So let's go back to the 12 years almost in the March 11, 2011. So you can see the epicenter offshore of the Sendai and the Tohoku. You can see the red cross. So epicenter was there, and we expect some kind of earthquake, but magnitude maybe 7.5. Much smaller than the 2011. At the time, 9 was recorded, and still 7th largest in the world. So before this one, we don't have such large earthquake tsunami before. So still aftershock continued. 2 years ago and last year, you can see the memo here. Earthquake continue with magnitude 7. Still, it is big, causing the damage again. So when earthquake happened, the tsunami was generated, and I investigated that area and collected the data and to make a simulation for us to understand what happened. So after the generation, tsunami reached to the coastal area 20 or 30 minutes after. This area is very complicated shoreline, so tsunami easily amplified like this. But in the south, Fukushima attacked to the directly, and in Sendai, it is not tsunami prone area before. So now 1.5 hours passed, so tsunami affected all area, and you can see the back current and going to the other area. This is a typical type of the tsunami oscillation. So at the time, the Japan Medical Agency issued a tsunami warning within 3 minutes before the tsunami arrived. But some of residents cannot starting the evacuation. Even they know the knowledge of the tsunami, but they cannot react very quickly. So anyway, again, they make a simulation to understand what happened at the time, especially new type of the tsunami. So you can see now the typical coastal area, it is a bay. So so tsunami is coming now, 30 minutes after the earthquake, and you can see the front of the tsunami coming to the beach and started to inundate. And here there is a sand dune and forest. But the tsunami overflowed. You can see the change of color from the blue to brown. So it means the sedimentation, suspended road and mat carried by the tsunami, and erosion happened. So tsunami first wave completely attacked to the city of the Rikuzen Takada, and now you can see the back current going back to the ocean side. So tsunami repeat, come and back and come back. So you can see again the sedimentation, and you can see the vortex inside, where many people are missing still now. So we cannot stop such large tsunami, but so we are discussing starting what we should improve and what we should do. So this is just briefly an idea of the seawall protect the coastal area. So it's blue line, height of the seawall, but the tsunami was much higher than the seawall. So, but the seawall can reduce the tsunami, but cannot complete. So we are now have the one idea for the tsunami, level first and level 2. First one is utilize the structure and try to save their life, and also some properties and area fully. But the huge tsunami such 2011 cannot. So we should combine non-structure both, at least to save their lives. So we have the example of the reconstruction at the Sendai. So we introduced some kind of multi-layer function or layers. Just 400 years ago, we have the history of the samurai. So at the time, Datema Samune had a similar damages by the earthquake tsunami, and he promoted the planting the forest, not allow for the people to live. So we followed his idea. Again, we kind of planning to utilize for the next tsunami and so on. This is the planning. So pink area are prohibited area. People cannot. But we can utilize some industrial area or green area for the parking. And we constructed a shelter to save their life. Or we move to the residential area more inside. And some highway are elevated. So as the rule of some dike. So this is just one slide. So 12 years has been passed. So even the people in Tohoku going to forget some kind of experience memory. So now we have the many function or doing, keeping the damaged building to learn something at that time. So we keep the hotel and elementary school along the coast. Now we have more than 50 building and facilities. So when you have the chance to visit the Japan and Tohoku, please explore this area so you can find something different. Yeah, I think. So thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Imamura. So we're going to have a discussion, and we'll lead it off with, Mohamed, you want to come up with me too? We have a few questions. First off, I know you've been an advocate for not just the importance of early warning, but also specific warning, that there was a real problem before with the kinds of warnings that people were getting, and now I understand that there's some changes that tell people, for example, you need to evacuate now. But could you say a little bit more about sort of the importance of specificity and warnings?
Thank you very much. So in Japan, the tsunami warning started more than 50 years ago after the 1933. It is very essential for us and the people to judge whether or not starting the evacuation. So in the beginning, just we have the kind of quantitative information, just no tsunami or middle type of tsunami and large type of tsunami. But now the technology improving, the monitoring for the earthquake tsunami improving. So we have the quantitative information to the many area with the tsunami height and arrival time. Arrival time is very essential when we should start. Then we have good system, and it was already started in 2011. But people cannot react. We have the information about the tsunami arrival time and the height, but we need more specific information. Since we are here, and sometimes we are, I cannot say, this protected by the seawall, sometimes 5-meter height, but when we have the tsunami height of the 3 meters, so it means don't need to evacuate. At the time, in the beginning of the tsunami warning, say only 3 meters, because of the kind of the very, I cannot say, the error of the observation of the earthquake. It was so large. So quantitative data, still we have the technical problem, but so we need new warning directed to us. So since you are here and tsunami will be attacked at the time of the sun and this area, so we need improve, I think.
Thank you. I know too that some of the reviews of the previous historical tsunamis revealed that some came from actually fairly small earthquakes, but yet generated really dangerous tsunamis, even worse because people weren't expecting something to come from a little tremble. So I imagine that the better instruments and the very much more specific information is a real potential lifesaver in those cases. I had one more question. I'll pass it to Mohamed. You've been involved in issues about green space and their interactions with some of these disasters, whether it was in the Indian Ocean earthquake and also in Japan, where in your slide it noted that some of the arrivals were slowed by a certain green belt that you spoke about, and we've had a whole bunch of atmospheric river-related floods in California of late, and some of the impacts have been very differentiated based on whether or not we lost wetlands and other kinds of things. But could you say something about the green impact?
Thank you very much. So the 2004 December 26th, the earthquake occurred in the offshore of the Indonesia, Sumatra, and generate the tsunami. I think it is one of worst tsunami and causing the 300,000 people died without any warning and without any structure and some designing along the coast. So it is, we are very sorry, and we went to there and we can see the damaged area. But some area are heavily damaged. But the other area, almost same topography, but with vegetation, especially the mangrove. So it reduced the impact. So level of the tsunami inundation are almost same. But the velocity of the tsunami, it means the current, so it means the wave force much less than theirs. So we can realize there's some kind of rule of the forest. Even this is the a kind of easily flow go through, but passing through the forest, some kind of energy dissipation we can observe. So this is applied to the not only tsunami but the storm surge and the river as well. But not perfectly stopped. So we have still discussion how we can combine the natural resources and some artificial one. I think.
Thank you. Do you want to ask anything? Or?
Actually, I'll open it up to see if there's a question from the audience.
The triple disaster is the earthquake the first of the triple disasters, and then tsunami, and then what is the third?
Third is the fire.
Fire?
Yes.
Okay.
And some landslide also occurred. And finally, accident on the Fukushima nuclear plant. It is not a natural disaster, but related with the earthquake tsunami. So still, we are trying to improve our safety level for the very important facilities, such as nuclear plant. So it is a combination and multiple disasters.
Okay. Thank you.
And one from the back over there.
Hello, I enjoyed your presentation. I'm Charles Hayes, Cal State LA, Department of Physics and Astronomy, blah, blah, blah. I'm struck by the design and using the forces to dissipate the energy of the tsunami. That's brilliant in terms of sustainability. But in this audience, I know there are many people in the Los Angeles area who are trying to take lessons learned from what is happening in Japan. I am very lucky to be a resident of Gifu. And so one thing I want to point out with respect to the specific warning, making just a layman's comparison between what happens in Japan versus the United States, when I'm watching the TV in NHK, whatever, and an earthquake happens, within seconds, warnings appear. And the news come on, all programming stops, and that is markedly different without, there are no words to explain the difference between what is being done in Japan compared to the United States and perhaps the rest of the world. So lessons learned. And the collaboration that is being initiated here, I think is key. And so that's all I wanted to say. I will stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, but every time after the disaster, we learn a lot and improving ourselves. Otherwise, we cannot reduce the future disasters. Thank you very much for sharing the information.
Thank you very much, Professor Imamura, and I think we'll proceed to the next presentation. I think there's going to be quite a bit more on the subject, so please stand by.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Professor Imamura, and welcome, Professor Renato Dalancon.
Good afternoon. In 2011, I was working with a group of students from Technical University in Berlin in the south of Chile, in a little village called Chanco, joining the efforts for reconstruction. It's a heritage area with simple construction means, and we were, doing it by ourselves. In doing so, we heard about the event in Japan, and we were appalled by seeing that this was strikingly similar to what we were seeing. It was the same, of course, the technology, the construction, the culture was different, but the kind of vulnerability was surprising, surprisingly similar. So we did learn from that earthquake and tsunami, and one thing that we learned from yours that we didn't learn from ours is that we wouldn't do any nuclear plants. There was a discussion at the time that we needed something of the sort, and it was quickly settled after it happened in Japan. Because if it happened there, what could you expect for ourselves? So there were lessons learned. And little would I know at the time that I would, 10, 12 years later be here in this network hosted by the Japan House in Los Angeles, talking about these things, and I have to be very emphatic in thanking our hosts and thanking the Consul General and Professor Abe and the University of California for having us. It's really, really amazing in continuing to learn and to refer to your experiences as well. Maybe I can contribute something on my behalf. What you see there is our icon for the earthquake. As you had the lady carrying the elderly woman away from the disaster, this picture was very much praised as the symbol of the drive towards reconstructing. You might question the sort of patriotic undertone, but there's something communitarian about it, meaning we are going to make it. We are going to reconstruct no matter what. And then this lifting this flag from the mud, which included, was of course driven by a tsunami also, was very meaningful and was in a communication level quite important. So I want to talk to you a little about what we learned, also about history, that I think it's quite an important issue, and how we, what we know, what we experience in the southern cone of the American continent. These are several earthquakes that we have registered of, let's say, relatively recent, from 1906, which is coincidental with the one in San Francisco as well, and several others. Some of them I have lived during my lifetime, others I haven't. Maybe there was one single more important one, or most important one, is the one in Valdivia, which holds the sad record of being the strongest ever 9.5 Richter scale earthquake. Fortunately, it didn't strike a zone that was so inhabited in the south of the country, so it didn't cause that much damage. At the time, maybe today would be much harder. In this comparison, if you can follow a bit, you might have a sense of that. What we learned in relation to our track record was to build a bit better. Yes, the building codes were improved in 1939 and earlier and a bit later too, so that we can say that in spite of being a relatively poor country, we have very good building standards. We comply them without, hesitation, and sparingly, of course, but always with an awareness that can support a relatively proficient performance. Nevertheless, this sort of destruction happens. The picture up left is also iconic for the 2010 earthquake, but we do have a certain kind of culture to earthquakes, which is something that we learn from the crib. You probably learn it in Japan, you probably learn it in California. You know what to do when an earthquake strikes. We have major earthquakes in Chile every 15 to 25 years. We have tsunamis every 100 years, so tsunamis we forget. Earthquakes we remember, we know for sure, we know it every day, 5 minutes, no worries. And so I wanted to then open a bit the Zoom to show you that, well, also in other countries as well, we have a variety of catastrophes I wanted to show you, and multiple hazards that we have to deal with a certain control over the vulnerability that we expose to them in order not to turn them into catastrophes, so that we can build and live with them and not against them. So I will try to show you a few of this that we have tried to understand from the perspective of architecture and maybe urban design, as of how do we transition from the catastrophe into the reconstruction area for 2 or 3 of these cases that have commonalities and differences. So we have volcano eruptions as well. We have them all, basically. So I will show you a few. This is one in Chaitén, that, the dust and ash went all the way to Buenos Aires, which is several thousand kilometers northeast, let's say. And this is more or less the transition that the little village of Chaitén suffered, not only because of the ash and smoke, but also because of the melting and the flooding of this sort of river cutting through the little village. The possibility of reconstructing is only this little bluish area in the center, basically 9 blocks. Everything else was either unsurveyed or impossible. So in the end, it turned out to be replaced. The city, the little village was relocated. And then we continue to have this. We have them in Calbuco, Yaima, Peyúgue, etc., other localities, and they continue to happen. Some of them have more of a damaging result. Some of them have less. We also have landslides and flash floods. This is the case of Chañaral, where we also worked with a group of students. There was, as you can see in the pink area below, that was the danger area as designated by the planning instruments. And this is how the flooding struck along the river, which is rather dry. This is the desertic north of the country, but it went basically right through, caused that kind of damage, and eventually, there it is, that's actually the flood. And eventually, 2 years later, another flood came from where the planning instruments had prevented. So they happen, even this recurrence happens in the same places. Other cases in Antofagasta and Villa Santa Lucia continue to happen. Forest and urban fires that we are going to hear in a second. This is Valparaíso. This is a big city that is something like an amphitheater looking on the sea. Was reached from the upper hills by the fire burning the forest areas that surround the city. So there you can see how these creeks and fire reached the city. This is the emergency situation and the measures being deployed and eventually the reconstruction. Other cases, Torres del Paine, Santa Olga, etc., continue to happen. So these things happen all the time. They come in all colors and forms. And I could show you several more in this survey we tried to do, but in order to stick to my 10 minutes, I'll keep it there. So we continue to have more often all sorts of disasters caused by multiple hazards, and we deal only very partially, mostly for earthquakes and much less for other hazards. So what do we learn? That these are not exceptions. Of course, you don't see them in the longer run. This is why you need this historical perspective. We know, but we don't know enough, collectively. It's not communicated in sufficient frequency and strength. And it leads us to question the way we develop and the way we deal with our landscape and natural resources. So we need to maintain memory. These images are quite impressive. We've seen those of the tsunami in Japan. These are the ones of the tsunami of 2010. And this needs then to drive us to broaden our seismic and hazard culture from seismic to multi-hazard, and poses a number of challenges of particularly understanding this variety, this diversity in this broad country that is small, maybe economically, but large geographically, with a long band of 4,000 kilometers that includes basically everything and is conveniently seated on a seismic fault, as you probably know. So this is probably the situation in other countries. We need to learn from that, and hopefully I will continue to learn with you as we did previously, and maybe help you understand as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Renato. That was incredible. When Professor Abe and the team, when we started this initiative, it was under the cloak of it was just before the advent of the global pandemic, and which sort of made these discussions, on the one hand, all the more pressing, and at the same time, in a strange way, all the more absurd. But luckily, we're here today. Professor Imamura and then Professor Renato Cohen, these presentations are obviously tied together, and this issue of in one of your, I think, penultimate slides, Renato, the local and indigenous knowledge. That's something that I think we'd all like to hear a little bit about, because obviously we're coming at this with sort of 21st century kind of understandings, predictive models, and so on and so forth, and then you bring up this more, if that's top down, a more sort of bottom up. If you could speak to that, and I know maybe to the student research as well.
Sure. Yeah, that was a big question opened by the earthquake of 2005 in the north, where also smaller villages of traditional construction were destroyed. And then the question was open as of if we could continue to rebuild them in raw clay, adobe construction, in the traditional way. And at the time, it was settled that raw clay was not continuous enough as to provide the basic data that an engineer would need to properly calculate and ensure the stability of the structure. Mm-hmm. So it was ruled out, at least in the public funding for housing reconstruction, 2005. Mm-hmm. And then in 2010, the exact opposite happened. This hit a broader area with smaller villages that were also built in traditional ways, and then the state system adapted a bit to it and promoted the construction and the preservation of this heritage, at least in partial way, right? So there's this question of time, of course. Earthquakes not only destroy our material heritage in the sense of the capital that there is invested, but also the culture that is invested in our buildings. And this is something that is very dear to architects. So we want to somehow preserve that dimension, and this is a very interesting architectural question. How do we, ensure that these things are safe and sound and 21st century, but at the same time, they somehow encompass this cultural background? Mm-hmm. There is no one answer, mm-hmm. but there's already a big, fat question.
Mm-hmm. And just to follow up on that, I'd like to point out to the audience of the 11 participant universities, I would say Chile was the only one where a kind of an explicit design agenda was not on the table. Rather, it was a sort of a bottom-up research agenda where students and professors were kind of learning from the people at street level. Maybe you could speak to that.
Well, we have sort of a program in our School of Architecture that is very much design-based and oriented. But at the same time, we want the students to be able not only to solve design problems and challenges, but also to formulate them. In order to formulate them, you need to go a little beyond. We are not scientists, but we need to go and do some research that is relevant to build the foundations of our design project, right? So this is what we were doing in this case. It was a coincidence. It could have been a design studio, but it happened this way, and we thought it appropriate because then we could go and try and formulate these questions with the students. This maybe, hopefully, you can note in the wells. But I think it's very, very important that we build these bridges. I think what Professor Imamura is doing, working with historians, is very relevant because it's not only about, the physics or the geology dimension of the phenomena, but also the history and the recurrence and the, society and community that is embedded into it. Because without this vulnerability, there wouldn't be a disaster. So there's, hazard times vulnerability equals disaster. So this is not as simple as just danger, risk, right? So there's this two-sided thing in the equation that we need to keep in mind, and we were, trying to do that.
Wonderful. So we're going to move on to the final speaker and hopefully incorporate audience questions at the end when we wrap up. Dr. Jack Cohen, handing over to you, codename Icarus.
My presentation is considerably narrower in its topic, my favorite topic being fire. The title is Wildland Urban Fire Disasters, a Structure Ignition Problem, and you are correct if you assume that by this title I mean that it's not a wildfire problem, which might be counterintuitive to you. And so this presentation is basically to explain and hopefully make you aware of how it is not a wildfire problem with regard to actually dealing with the issue of wildfire and communities burning associated with that. So to begin that, let's talk about inevitable wildland fire that has two principal contexts affecting human values. So when I say human values, we have values more than just our communities. We also depend on the planet we live on. And so there are other kinds of values that we derive from fire. So let's get into this about that difference by discussing inevitable wildland fire that has two principal contexts affecting human values. So it's an appropriate process in fire-adapted ecosystems in sustaining natural resources, a natural disturbance, but simultaneously it's a threat of disastrous community fire destruction during extreme wildfires, a natural hazard. So let's take a look at it as a natural disturbance. We need to accept that wildland fire has an inevitable, appropriate, and essential ecological process at landscape scales for all fire-adapted ecosystems, and that includes low-intensity fire as well as high-intensity fire. While I'm talking about this, keep in mind that Native Americans, before Western Europeans got here, discovered this place, did quite well with fire, igniting fire. In fact, they were a principal fire igniter on the landscape, and then living with it. So now, we largely have a non-functioning ecological fire occurrence. Over a century of wildfire suppression has largely eliminated wildland fire as an appropriate ecological factor in the Western U.S., resulting in a condition that we call the wildfire paradox. And that is our attempt to exclude wildfire as a bad thing has actually increased the potential for extreme wildfire conditions over extensive areas. And because of that, ironically and paradoxically, our fire suppression for protection of communities has actually increased wildfire as a natural hazard to communities. So that presents us with a very profound challenge. How can we have wildland fire as an appropriate ecological factor at landscape scales requiring long durations without having wildland urban fire disasters? So understanding how structures ignite reveals opportunities for preventing wildland urban fire disasters and at the same time potentially having fire as an appropriate ecological process. So this is what I'm talking about. The wildland urban fire disaster where many homes and other structures burned to total destruction during extreme wildfire conditions. And by extreme wildfire, that's actually a relationship to our inability to control the wildfire. It has nothing to do necessarily with the severity of ecological results. So for the purpose of analysis, I've defined a wildland-urban fire disaster as having 100 or more totally destroyed structures, usually houses. And note that in my title and in this discussion so far, I'm not including the geographic reference, interface, or intermix, or any other geographic calculation as a term. And I'll explain this later. So how do homes and other structures ignite related to wildfires? Let's take a look at post-fire paradise. Now, shortly after, I got the question, can you explain this unusual pattern of destruction? Now, that question has an assumption that somehow or another, the green trees, the unconsumed canopies around total destruction is unusual. But it's not. It's the typical pattern of destruction. So when we see a scene like this, commonly, people see the destruction and miss the rest. They're not looking at what's still there. And that's important because typical patterns of wildland-urban fire destruction do not support high-intensity wildfire flames sweeping through communities. So in this particular case, Los Alamos in 2000, these homes ignited with low flame contact, low intensity flame contact, burning on the surface from the extreme wildfire. Let's take a look at what that was during the destruction. So most homes burned hours after the wildland fire spread past the community. Intense wildfire never spread to the community, particularly to this residential area. And notice that the houses are burning, but not the tree canopies. These homes ignited from lofted burning embers from the wildfire, but the wildfire flames never got to the community while the community burned. So unconsumed tree canopies amid total destruction indicate wildfire flames did not spread through the community, burning trees did not ignite the homes, and ironically, burned trees were ignited from the homes burning. So although initiated by wildfires, wildfires do not spread through communities. Community fuels, structures and vegetation within the community continue the fire spread hours after wildfire influence has ceased. The community burns without the wildfire. So in order to appreciate this, our perspective needs to be grounded in how fire works. We're talking about now a process that can be described by this diagram: fuel, heat, and oxygen, a sufficiency of which is required in order for fire to occur. Now, in this particular scene, the fuel is typically considered the vegetation, and the heat is the other burning vegetation adjacent to it, and in these cases, oxygen is always sufficient. Not necessarily plentiful, but sufficient. Well, so fire is a combustion process that occurs right at the fuel. It's not a mass or an energy transfer that comes from somewhere else to get there. So fire is not an independent thing that travels to that location. Fire requires a sustained sufficiency of fuel, heat, and the sufficiency of oxygen burning at that location. And fire spreads when ignition requirements are met locally at the adjacent fuels in a stepwise process. We may see it as a continued thing moving along, but it's not. At the scale of the ignition, it is a stepwise process, one distance at a time. So let's take a look at an example. We have a crown fire, a high-intensity fire spreading from right to left. It gets to the first residential street, a gap of about 12 meters, and the requirements for combustion of the trees on the other side of the gap were not met. And yet, for another 2.5 blocks, all the structures burned. Total destruction. How did it happen? Well, it didn't happen from the flames directly. It happened from burning embers that were lofted out and showered in a blizzard of burning embers into those locations where the ignitions initiated structures, and then the structures contributed to the fire spread, flames, and burning embers from the structures. So let's take a look at, let's get a feel for what that looks like. We've got a full-size house inside this laboratory. We've got gutters filled with pine needle debris, plastic, aluminum, and plastic. We have we have debris on the roof. We have debris around the base, vinyl siding, fiber cement, non-flammable, and composition, fiber composition board. Let's take a look. Now, there is no flame contact, as evidenced by the technicians that are standing there. There is no flame exposure on these structures until the burning embers initiate ignitions in the pine needles around the base, and we'll notice ignitions in the pine needles in the gutters, as well as later on the roof. The roof is asphalt composition shingle, which is not highly ignitable and does not spread fire. So what you're looking at here is how it is that we wouldn't necessarily get the wildfire into the community, and yet we can initiate ignitions within the community because of its characteristics, because of its ignition vulnerabilities. What you're seeing there is exactly the vulnerabilities in Paradise, California. So let me move on. So structure ignitions are determined by local ignition conditions at the structure by meeting the requirements for combustion. Structure ignitions are not determined by geographic location, and this is why I dropped the geographic reference of interface. Why? Because creating insufficient fuel and heat local to structures can potentially prevent wildland-urban fire disasters. You don't necessarily have to move out of the geographic classification. So wildland-urban fire is determined by local ignition conditions at the structures in the community. And that changes the context of this diagram, because now we're interested in the fuel being the house, the thing that can ignite, and the heat that's transferred for ignition are due to burning materials on and adjacent to homes and structures, burning embers and other flaming materials. Wildland-urban fire is a structure ignition problem, not a wildfire control problem. Intense simultaneous heating across wide areas of structures does not occur. Local conditions determine home ignitions. So how big is local? Well, so wildland-urban fire research using modeling, computational modeling, experiments both in laboratories and field, and disaster examinations have determined that a home in relation to burning materials within 30 meters principally determine home ignitions during extreme wildfires. And this area is called the home ignition zone, or the HIZ. The HIZ is that area that principally determines structure ignitions. And that means, this is a principal message here, that mitigating structure ignition vulnerabilities in relation to the exposure due to burning embers and the flames of burning materials within 30 meters principally reduces a home's wildfire risk, and collectively an entire community. Total destruction does not indicate high-intensity wildfire exposure. These 4 homes ignited and freely burned to total destruction without available fire protection. So local HIZ conditions were not sufficient for home ignition here, and wildfire suppression was not necessary. In this case, local HIZ conditions were sufficient for home ignition, and structure protection wasn't available. Home ignition vulnerability in relation to burning embers and burning within the HIZ determined these results. So fuel treatment, we often hear about fuel treatment for reducing community wildfire risk, but it's most effective within the HIZs and collectively within the communities, not within the wildlands. So how do wildland-urban fire disasters occur? And this is the logistics issue of potentially changing our approach to how we reduce risk due to wildfire. So let's start with severe fire conditions. And then given an ignition, we end up with extreme wildland fire. And by definition that I gave earlier, wildfire suppression is overwhelmed. Then, given an exposure to ignition vulnerable communities, we initiate numerous simultaneous ignitions that overwhelm structure fire protection. Most homes go without protection. They freely burn to total disaster. Wildland urban fire disasters have only occurred when wildfire suppression and structure protection fails during extreme fire conditions. And the special case, which has become all too frequent, is in high-density residential development where there is an overlapping of potentially numerous home ignition zones, where numerous ownerships are sharing roughly in the same home ignition zone. That doesn't change the physics of ignition and fire, but it certainly changes the social dynamics of responsibility and communitarianism. We end up with an urban conflagration. So extreme wildfire initiates numerous ignitions in a high-density community. The community burns without further wildfire influence well after the wildfire, and this is the result. And what do we need to understand from this? That high-density development not only requires ignition resistance, but it also requires structure-to-structure fire spread resistance to prevent disastrous community fire destruction. So our increased trend, well, let's start with the decade of 1985 to 1994. In that decade, approximately 9,000 houses were destroyed. And now, the decade of 2012 to 2021, 40,000 houses have been totally destroyed. So what's our response? Increased national attention and funding to increase firefighter effectiveness to do what? To reduce wildland urban fire disasters by controlling wildfires. So we're continuing to increase our emergency response capability with these tools, which are the same wildfire control and structure protection approach that has failed to prevent wildland urban fire disasters. So let's go back. Extreme wildfire. The conditions that overwhelm suppression and control, regardless of whether it's continuous conifer forest or whether it's grass and light shrubs. But we can interrupt this sequence if houses don't ignite and burn. At that point, structure protection's not overwhelmed. Most structures, if not all, are protected, and the disaster doesn't occur. But don't take from this that somehow we don't need fire protection. Why? Because ignition resistance isn't fireproof. We live there. By virtue of living there and liking the ambiance, we make it more ignition vulnerable. So ignition resistance eliminates most ignitions, but importantly, ignition resistance enables effective fire suppression, fire protection for structure ignitions that do occur. A structure ignition approach that creates ignition-resistant HIZs and collectively ignition-resistant communities can effectively prevent wildland urban fire disasters. So these homes didn't require wildfire control to survive. Wildland urban fire disasters can most effectively and practically be prevented by creating community ignition resistance, not by attempting to control inevitable extreme wildfire. Ironically, reestablishing wildland fire as an appropriate ecological natural disturbance at landscape scales will require ignition-resistant communities, not the other way around. So ignition-resistant homes and communities means having wildfires and wildland fires without wildland urban fire disasters.